Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about why it's important to study the whole masters in the context of your own development as an artist. This is a very important subject because a lot of you are perhaps not aware of the great tradition that existed in the past of studying great masterworks in order to advance your own interests as an artist. This is important. This is something that I've talked about constantly here on my channel in the context of art education and developing your own skills and techniques. So, one of the things that I've done in the past 2 years is develop curriculums that address this very important subject. I have set up classes in Udemy, and I've also established online live courses one on one with a small group of students, and we go through a whole process of copying masterworks, such as the painting that you see behind me, a painting now that has disappeared from the Isabella Gardner Museum. This painting was stolen. And what we did in the class is we set up all the materials that Rembrandt would have been using. We copied the painting step by step, layer by layer, using the same pigments. This is a wonderful exercise for a lot of you that are interested in recreating these techniques. A lot of students are perhaps lost when it comes to materials. Modern materials are not the same as the traditional materials that the old masters were using. So this is important. So in my classes address this. This is one of the reasons that I've set up these classes to guide the student through that whole process in the recreation of those techniques. This semester, we're going to be discussing the techniques of Titian. And Titian was a very innovative artist from the Venetian school. He left a lasting legacy with a lot of the Italian painters from the north, as well as artists such as Caravaggio, Rubens, Velasquez, and of course, Rembrandt. They looked up to the late Titian, and specifically in his innovations in terms of space, in terms of form modality, which is the depiction of form and color. And this was very important for the development of 17th century art and later Impressionist art. So, a lot of you that are interested in contemporary art, there's a lot of modern contemporary artists that have kind of gone back to the study, specifically abstract artists, and have studied how Titian handled form to be able to depict and create new styles. So that's something that I talk about in my own classes. One of the reasons that students engage in this idea of copying and reconstructing old masterworks is to not only learn the techniques and the sequences and the materials, but also to nurture their own creativity. The artists that we study are artists that we admire. This is important because that legacy, where we kind of inherit that legacy when we study their works, not only the techniques but also the aesthetics. A lot of artists that are working today prefer to work from photographs, but there was a time where artists were looking for the inspiration from these great artists in terms of style, in terms of technique. So that's something that we address in the classes, and is so vital to your own development as an artist. So one of the things that just to give you a few examples, we will, for example, reconstruct the ground. I do this with every single master that we have copied. So far, we have done classes on Rembrandt early techniques, Rembrandt late techniques, Caravaggio early techniques, and for in this semester, we're going to be studying Titian. We're going to be copying Flora, which is one of the great masterpieces that Titian painted in his early period. And we're going to study how Titian used this gesso ground. Here on the channel, I've addressed that subject in the past, where he constructs a gesso ground that is semi-absorbent. This is key to his technique because he's building many layers of paint. And there's artists from the later period, from the 17th century, that will adapt and innovate that technique. So by constructing all these courses and studying the evolution of some of these painters, artists are able to sort of have a library of knowledge that goes from the beginnings of the technique or the mother technique through an evolution that will take them through their own development. And that's one of the key factors in some of these classes that I teach. So you could set up your own schedule. You know, when you're copying masterworks, you could go to the museums. Recently, I traveled to some of the museums in Northern Europe and Spain to study some of these old masters. This is something that I do here on the channel. I go once a year or once every 2 years. I'll take a trip and I'll study the works in person to detect some of the techniques that they were using. For example, some of the reproductions that you will see in some of these books do not depict the painting how they actually look in real life. So it's important to go to the museums and to see the works in person so you're able to have a good idea of the techniques. For example, a lot of artists today are copying old masterworks in alla prima style, and most of these old works are constructed works. They're meaning that they're essentially three-dimensional objects painted on a two-dimensional surface, meaning that there's many layers, and the artist is constructing from perhaps a double ground or a single ground, where they are building an underpainting or a grisaille, and you will not see those effects through a photographic reference or a photographic reproduction of some of these paintings. So that's something that we do. I'm using also scientific knowledge and scientific findings to inform my courses. I'm very, very adamant about that. And I'm also using the historical texts, such as old manuscripts, to be able to inform the student on the techniques that were documented and used by some of these old masters. So we're using the scientific information and the historical information to create a consensus of the information that we're going to be using in the context of some of these copies. This is very useful, specifically X-rays, cross-sections, and this helps us to be able to put together this almost like investigative detective work, how these paintings were put together and how they were assembled. Of course, we will never be in the master studio. That's not the point of the courses. The point of the course is essentially to create a basis for our departure point on how the old master might have began the painting or constructed the painting. This is important because students begin to create a context of technique. A lot of students today, they're used to seeing perhaps a book that simplifies the process and says, okay, well, all these masters use a grisaille, and they just take that as such, and every old master use, this pigment, and that's not really the case. My research has found that a lot of the old masters were very idiosyncratic with their techniques, and that's very important when we're studying the old master works. That's one of the most important things. In short, copying old master works is a very useful exercise to develop your skills as an artist. This is a tradition that has persisted for a very long time. It's part of the tradition of painting. And I want to invite you to check out some of my courses in the description below, where you could find information for my one-on-one live courses and also for my Udemy courses. Those are pre-recorded courses that are much lighter. They're meant as an introduction for those of you that do not have the time to engage in a full semester. You could check out my Udemy courses. These courses are pre-recorded and they're organized in chapters that you could easily watch at home and progress along with some of the different techniques that we've been talking about here in the channel. So again, I want to thank you for joining and watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, make sure to subscribe to receive future notifications for my live presentations. I also want to invite you to check out some of my social media sites, such as my Instagram page and my TikTok. I'm always posting videos there with different subjects on old master techniques. So thanks again for watching.